"Get your coat," Arthur said. His voice dropped so low. I almost missed it beneath the sound of the furnace kicking on. His hand gripped the doorframe of my back porch, knuckles pale. "Don't wake your son. There's something you have to see before this wedding goes one step further." I was holding my coffee mug in both hands. The kitchen smelled like hazelnut, the same blend my husband had ordered by the case from a roaster in Quebec City. Steam curled off the surface. Outside the window, the October sky over Kingston was the color of old pewter, not quite light, not quite dark. My son was upstairs, getting dressed to marry the woman he was certain was the love of his life. And Arthur Finley, who had managed the grounds of the property for 22 years, who had driven me home from the hospital the night my husband slipped away, who had never in all those years asked me for anything unreasonable, was standing at my back door with something close to dread on his face. I set the mug down. I should tell you that I almost didn't answer the door. I was already running 10 minutes behind the morning's schedule, already fighting with the clasp on my mother's pearl bracelet, already rehearsing, in my head, the speech I planned to give at the reception about how my son had found his person and how proud his father would have been. I had been looking forward to giving that speech. My husband passed 2 years ago in March, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. My son took it hard in the quiet way that men of his temperament do. He didn't fall apart visibly. He just grew smaller somehow, more careful about joy, like he'd learned for the first time that good things could be taken without warning. For a year, he threw himself entirely into the property management company my husband had built from 2 rental units in 1987 into what it was now, 15 commercial properties across eastern Ontario, a staff of 30, a reputation my husband had spent his whole working life earning. Then he met her at a fundraiser gala at the K-Rock Center. He came home that night looking the way he used to look as a small boy on Christmas morning. Open-faced. Certain. He said her name once, Sienna, and I watched something loosen in him that had been wound tight for a year. I wanted to believe in her because he did. There had been a moment, about 6 months in, when something felt wrong. She'd asked me, over dinner, very casually, how the succession planning worked for the company. Whether my son was the sole director, whether I had any formal role. The questions themselves weren't unusual. A woman getting serious about a man would naturally want to understand his life. But her eyes moved across the room as she asked them, landing on the artwork, the furniture, the view of the St. Lawrence. Not rude, just measuring. I told myself I was being the difficult kind of mother-in-law. I told myself grief makes you suspicious. I told myself my son was a grown man of 41 who had his father's intelligence and his father's instincts, and he would not be fooled by someone who didn't deserve him. I was wrong to silence myself, and I have to live with that. Last night, at the rehearsal dinner at the inn outside of town, where the ceremony was being held today, I had pulled my son aside near the coat room. I had taken his hands in mine, and I had said carefully that I had a feeling I couldn't name, and would he please just talk to me for a minute. He had looked at me with such patience and such exhausted love that I felt ashamed for bringing it up. "Mum," he said, "you've worried about every relationship I've had since Dad died. I know you're scared. I'm scared too, a little bit. That's just what loving someone feels like. But she's wonderful. She's genuinely wonderful. Just trust me on this one, please." I had let go of his hands. I had gone back to the table. I had watched Sienna laugh at something one of the groomsmen said, her hand resting lightly on my son's arm, and I had told myself one more time to stop. So when Arthur Finley appeared at my back door at 7 in the morning with fear on his face, I did not hesitate. I put down the mug. I got my coat. His truck smelled like wood shavings and the old pine air freshener he'd been hanging from his rearview mirror for as long as I'd known him. We pulled out of the laneway before I had even finished buttoning up. The neighborhood was just waking, lights in kitchen windows, a man walking a retriever along the sidewalk, frost on the parked cars. Arthur drove for a moment without speaking. I let him. "I got a call," he finally said. "2 nights ago. A woman, wouldn't give her name, said she'd found my number through the company website, said she'd been sitting on something and couldn't sit on it anymore." He exhaled slowly. "She's a neighbor, lives 2 doors down from a house on Elgin Street, West Side. She said she'd been watching a woman she recognized from the engagement announcement in the paper, coming and going from that house for months. Said she knew things weren't right, but didn't know who to tell." I said nothing. The truck moved through an intersection. "I drove past the house myself yesterday," Arthur said, "and then I went back again this morning. Early." He glanced at me. "There's a family living there." I heard the word family and felt something cold settle behind my sternum. We turned onto a street I knew vaguely. Modest houses, old trees, the kind of neighborhood that had been working class in the 70s and hadn't changed much. Arthur slowed and parked across from a yellow brick bungalow with a blue half door and a child's tricycle on the front walk. "Watch the side door," Arthur said, "the one off the carport." I watched. We sat for 4 minutes. I counted them. Then the side door opened. She came out first, Sienna, dressed in jeans and a gray pullover, her hair tied back, moving with the quick efficiency of someone in a familiar routine. Nothing like the woman who had sat across my dinner table 3 Sundays in a row, charming and composed. This Sienna moved like someone in her own home because she was. "Mama, wait." A small boy appeared in the doorway, 4 years old maybe, blonde, in a dinosaur sweatshirt, holding a piece of toast. "You forgot to say goodbye." I pressed my hand flat against the passenger window. Sienna crouched down and held his face in both hands, said something I couldn't hear from across the street, kissed his forehead. Then a man appeared behind the boy. Late 30s, tired eyes, a quality of defeat in the set of his shoulders that I recognized because I had worn something like it myself in those first months after my husband died. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder and looked at Sienna with something that was not quite anger and not quite love, just the complicated, worn, thin face of someone who has run out of better options. Sienna stood up. She touched the man's arm once briefly and went back inside the way she'd come. Arthur's voice was quiet. "His name is Joel. I looked him up through the property records. The house is in both their names. They've been together at least 5 years." I opened the truck door and got out before he finished the sentence. I walked across the street to the blue half door and I knocked. The man who answered, Joel, looked at me with the wariness of someone who has been braced for bad news for a long time. "My name is Caroline Caldwell," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "I believe you know my son. He's marrying Sienna today." The color went out of his face so completely that I reached out and held the door frame, not for myself, but in case he needed it. He let me in. The living room was small and neat, with a boy's drawings taped to the wall beside the television, and a stack of library books on the coffee table. Joel sat down heavily in the chair nearest the window. I sat across from him. My son's wedding was in 3 hours. The story came out in pieces. He and Sienna had been together since before the boy was born. Common law, then legally married 18 months in. The boy's name was Theo. He was 4.5. When Sienna had lost her job during the pandemic and their savings ran out, they had borrowed privately. A man Joel called only the lender. Not a bank. The terms had been the kind you agreed to in desperation and regretted the moment the ink dried. Sienna had started researching families, his word, researching, looking for a solution the way a person does when they've been backed into a corner and all the legal doors are closed. She had found my husband's obituary first, then the company profile, then my son's name as the new director. She went to that gala on purpose, Joel said, not meeting my eyes. She'd been following his schedule for weeks before. His charity work, the events he attended. He was quiet for a moment. She said she'd get herself onto the company as a co-director through the marriage, access the joint accounts they'd set up for the household, and once she had what we needed to pay off the debt, she'd stage a separation. Reasonable grounds. Clean exit. She said your son would be looked after. Financially, she wasn't going to take everything. As if the scale of the theft was the part that should comfort me. She was protecting Theo, Joel said, and his voice broke on his son's name in a way that was the most honest thing I'd heard in a very long time. I know how that sounds. I know what she did. But she was trying to keep our son safe. I looked at the drawings on the wall, a house with a red roof, a dog or possibly a horse, a sun with too many rays. I asked Joel if he had anything in writing. He did. He'd kept everything. Not because he was planning to come forward, but because he'd been keeping everything out of habit. The habit of a man who trusted nothing anymore. A marriage certificate, registered in Ontario, 4 years old. Photographs. Bank statements with Sienna's name printed clearly. Texts she had sent him over the past 2 years, clinical and specific. The Hayes Company assets, the account structures, the timeline she'd built. My son's name appeared in those messages 15 times. He had been referred to consistently as the asset. Arthur was waiting on the front walk. I handed him the folder. Call the Kingston police, I said. Not now, give me until the ceremony, but I need them at the inn before 11. He took out his phone without a word. On the drive to the inn, I tried 3 times to reach my son. Each time it went to voicemail. He had told me the night before that he was putting his phone on silent during the morning so he could be present. My son has always been like that, deliberate about moments, trying to hold them properly. I left no message. What I had to say couldn't be said in 30 seconds against a voicemail. Beep. The inn sat on a few acres east of the city, converted from an old limestone farmhouse, the kind of place that photographs beautifully in every season. Cars were already filling the gravel lot when Arthur turned in. Guests in their good coats, the florist's van unloading near the side entrance. A morning designed from every angle to look exactly like happiness. I found my son in the small room off the main hall they'd set aside for the groom's party. He was standing in front of a mirror in his charcoal suit. His best friend from university stood behind him, straightening his collar, saying something that made my son laugh. A real laugh. The sound of it hit me somewhere beneath my ribs. He saw me in the doorway and smiled, the uncomplicated smile he had, the one that was his father's smile, and said, "Mum, you look wonderful." "I need 5 minutes with you," I said, privately. The smile shifted into something quizzical. He glanced at his watch. "It's important," I said. He nodded and touched his friend's shoulder. "Give us a minute," and then we were alone in the hallway. I had the folder in my hand. I had a speech prepared. But before I could start, the door at the end of the hall opened and Sienna appeared, still in a silk robe, her hair half done, and her face moved through a very fast sequence when she saw us standing together. Just for a moment, surprise, then calculation, then warmth, perfectly arranged. "There you are," she said, coming directly toward my son and sliding her hand into his. "I've been looking everywhere. We need you for the photos before everything gets started." She looked at me with a smile that was bright and impenetrable. "We can steal him back in just 15 minutes, I promise." She drew him away down the hall before I could speak. He looked back once over his shoulder, apologetic, mouthing sorry, and then he was gone around the corner. I stood holding the folder. The ceremony was in the restored barn at the back of the property. High ceilings, old timber beams, winter light through long windows, every seat filled. I sat in the front row on the left side, the folder inside my handbag, the clasp of my mother's bracelet digging into my wrist. The officiant called for quiet. The music started, something my son had chosen himself, a piece he and his father used to listen to on long car trips. My throat tightened. The wedding party entered. My son walked in from the side door and took his place at the front, and the look on his face when he turned toward the back of the room and waited for her. That open, undefended face was the thing I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, because I knew what I was about to do to it. Sienna came down the aisle in ivory, measured and graceful, her bouquet of white dahlias held perfectly still. The guests leaned forward. The room breathed together. The officiant welcomed everyone, spoke about commitment and partnership, about building something that holds. And then, as they always do, she asked, "If anyone here knows a lawful reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or remain silent." The pause that follows that question is meant to be empty. Everyone knows it. Everyone expects it. I stood up. The sound of the fabric of my coat moving, the small creak of my chair. It seemed impossibly loud. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it genuinely, to everyone in that room except one person. "But I have to stop this." The silence that followed was absolute, and then immediately fractured. Whispers, the scrape of chairs, someone near the back saying, "Oh my God." My son turned from the altar with an expression I had no name for. Open wound would come closest. "Mum." His voice was low and careful, the way you speak to someone you're frightened for. "What are you doing?" I walked toward the altar. Each step felt both very slow and unstoppable. "The woman standing beside you," I said, and I looked at Sienna, who had gone very still, her bouquet pressed against her chest. Her eyes locked on mine with the flat, measuring quality I had seen for a moment across my dinner table 18 months ago, is already married, legally, in the province of Ontario, for 4 years. The room erupted. My son flinched backward like I had pushed him. "That is insane," Sienna said, and her voice came out steady, almost bored, which told me something about how many times she had rehearsed for a version of this. She's been opposed to this relationship from the beginning. She can't accept that her son is moving on. Don't listen to this. "Her husband's name is Joel," I said. "They have a son. His name is Theo. He's 4 years old." My son's face, God, his face. "Mom," just the one word, barely a sound. The door at the back of the barn opened. Joel walked in, holding Theo by the hand. The little boy was wearing a small plaid shirt, his hair combed flat. He walked in that earnest way small children do when they've been told to be good and are concentrating very hard on it. He looked around the room, at all the people, at the flowers, and then he saw his mother standing at the front in her white dress. His whole face changed. "Mama!" He pulled free of Joel's hand and ran down the center aisle in the delighted, heedless way of a child who has spotted exactly the person he wanted. "Mama, you look like a princess." The room, all of it, went completely silent. Sienna's composure left her all at once, the way warmth leaves a room when a window breaks. Her face crumpled, her hands shook. The bouquet of dahlias fell and hit the stone floor with a dry scatter of petals. "Joel," she said, and it came out as nothing but breath. "You can't. You weren't supposed to." "I know," he said. He had stopped a few meters short of the altar. He had picked Theo up and was holding him against his shoulder, so the boy couldn't see his mother's face clearly. "I know I wasn't, but I can't keep letting this happen." He looked at my son directly. "She is my wife. We were married here in Ontario 4 years ago. I have the certificate. I have everything. I'm sorry. You deserved better than this." My son's best friend caught his arm. My son was not going to fall, but he looked like someone who had forgotten, temporarily, how standing worked. "Sienna," my son's voice when it came was barely his own. "Tell me he's lying. Tell me one true thing, anything." Sienna looked at her husband. She looked at her son in his arms. She looked at my son standing at the altar in the suit he'd bought 3 months ago for this day. She sank to the floor among the fallen dahlias and said nothing. The nothing was the answer. I stepped forward and spoke quietly, not to wound further, but because it had to be said. Her debt was real, her desperation was real. But the choice to build a life on someone else's, on my son's grief and his willingness to love again. That was never forced on her. There is no debt large enough to justify this. The police arrived with quiet discretion, 2 officers who spoke first with Arthur near the door and then made their way to the front. My son stood to one side. He did not watch when they spoke to Sienna. He was looking at the floor, his hand pressed flat against his chest, the same gesture his father used to make when he was trying to hold himself together in public. I stood beside my son. I did not speak. I did not try to reach for him. I just stayed close enough that he could feel I was there. Theo was confused and beginning to pick up on the distress around him. Arthur, who had sat through every school concert my son ever performed in, who had taught him to skate on the pond at the back of our property, went quietly to Joel and offered to take the boy outside to see the garden while things were settled. Joel looked at Arthur for a moment, reading him, then nodded. Arthur carried Theo out through the side door, and I could hear the boy asking questions about the big stone walls, voice growing lighter with curiosity as they moved away from all of it. One of the officers, a woman with a steady professional manner, spoke to me briefly. Arthur had provided the documents. The marriage certificate was sufficient for the immediate charge. There would be more to follow: fraud, identity misrepresentation. She asked if I'd be available for a formal statement. I said yes. Sienna was led out through the side entrance. She looked back once, not at me. She looked at the empty spot where Theo had been standing, and her face held something complicated and real, the only real thing I had seen from her in 2 years. Then the door closed behind her. The guests began to leave in quiet, careful clusters. People touched my arm as they passed. A few squeezed my son's shoulder. No one knew what words to use, so most of them used none, which was the right choice. My son sat down in the front row. He sat the way children sit when they've been hurt somewhere deep. Not crying, just very still and very small. I sat beside him. The barn was almost empty. Someone had thought to turn the music off, and the silence had a quality to it that was almost gentle. He spoke first. "How long did you know?" "Since this morning," I said. "Arthur called me at 7. He was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me before the ceremony?" "I tried last night," I said. "You told me I worried about every relationship you'd had since your father died." He closed his eyes briefly. "I did say that." "You were right that I worry," I said. "But I was right that something was wrong. We were both right about different things." He didn't answer for a moment. "I tried again this morning," I said. "In the hall, she came." "She always came," he said, and there was something very tired in his voice, the tiredness of a man looking back and rearranging everything he thought he knew. I thought it was just, affectionate, that she wanted to be around me. I thought it was love. I reached over and took his hand. "She targeted me," he said quietly, not a question. "She found Dad's obituary. She looked me up. She planned it." "Yes." He sat with that for a long time. Outside, I could faintly hear Arthur's voice and Theo's voice, the boy asking something cheerful, Arthur answering in his easy, unhurried way. "That little boy," my son said. "He didn't know any of this." "No, he couldn't have." He rubbed his free hand across his face. "What happens to him?" "His father has him," I said. "Joel is a decent man in an impossible situation. I intend to help with the legal costs where I can. The boy shouldn't suffer for his mother's choices." My son looked at me. "Dad would have done that," he said. "I know," I said. "I'm trying." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and for a moment he looked so much like his father in the early years. Before the success, before the company, when they were young and everything was still uncertain, that I had to look away. "What do I do now?" he asked. "Right now," I said, "you let Arthur drive us home. You eat something. You call your friend and let him sit with you this afternoon. And tomorrow, you start the part that's harder and longer and doesn't have a clear end date." He almost smiled. "You make it sound very manageable." "I'm your mother," I said. "That's the job." 3 months later, on a Tuesday in January, my son came into my kitchen with a folder of papers from the lawyers and set them on the table beside my coffee. The criminal charges had proceeded. The charges, bigamy, fraud, misrepresentation, carried real weight under the criminal code. Sienna was facing a process that would take time, and the outcome was not yet final, but the case was solid. My son had gone back to work in October. Slowly at first, then with increasing steadiness, the way healing actually moves. Not in a straight line, but in a general direction. He had started going to a counselor. Not because I suggested it, but because he came to it himself, which meant it was actually helping. He told me she was helping him understand the difference between being cautious and being closed. That what happened to him was not evidence that his judgment was fundamentally broken, only that he had been deceived by someone who was skilled at deception. That the capacity to love and trust was not the flaw. That it was, in fact, the part of him worth keeping. Joel had sent me a card at Christmas. Handwritten, short. He thanked me for helping with the legal fees. He said Theo was doing well. He said Theo had started junior kindergarten and loved it, and asked every morning whether they were going to school yet, before his father had finished making breakfast. I put the card on the refrigerator beside my son's school photo from grade 3, which has lived on my refrigerator for 38 years, and which I see no reason to take down. Arthur came for dinner on a Sunday in December. My son, halfway through his second glass of wine, looked at him across the table and said, "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you." Arthur waved it off the way he does. My son shook his head and said, "No, I mean it. What you did." And then he stopped, and Arthur reached over and gripped his shoulder briefly, firmly. And that was the end of that conversation, because nothing else needed to be said. My son calls him Uncle Arthur now. He started saying it as a joke, but it settled into something real. I still keep the bracelet clasp half-fastened, the way it was the morning Arthur appeared at my door. I don't know why. Maybe to remember that I did not stay in the kitchen with my coffee and ignore the fear on a good man's face. Maybe to remember that the instincts I had been burying for 2 years turned out to be correct, and that next time, if there is a next time, I will not bury them quite so deeply or quite so long. My husband built everything he built by trusting what he knew and saying it plainly even when it was unwelcome. I spent 2 years thinking I was honoring his memory by keeping the peace. What I understand now is that the better way to honor him was exactly what I did on that October morning in the barn. To stand up, to speak clearly, and to choose my son over the discomfort of the moment. One hard truth spoken in time against a lifetime of a lie allowed to stand. My son is still healing. He will be for a while, but he is healing as himself. Open enough to be hurt, steady enough to continue. That is everything his father was, and everything I could ask for.